as Africans overtook Native Americans as the primary source of enslaved labor in certain parts of the America, only in certain parts of America, free and enslaved Native peoples continued to interact with slavery in important ways. While many natives joined fugitive slaves in multi-ethnic Maroon communities, others supported the enslavement of Africans by capturing escaped slaves, eventually owning African slaves themselves. So I'm going to go through just a few examples across the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries of sort of synthetic ways to think about these, what the sort of the insights that we've developed in the last 20, 25 years. And then I'll sort of turn to some questions and suggestions. New Spain is probably the story that many scholars know at least the first several years, right? They're the first Europeans to enslave natives in large numbers, and they quickly adapted themselves to native practices of slave taking and eventually trade many hundreds of thousands and perhaps as many as 2 million enslaved people over the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Europeans' enslavement of indigenous Americans began, of course, in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus captured 7 Tainos, hoping to take them to Spain, that they may talk. Columbus believed that these natives would make slaves, and with 50 men, they could all be held and subjected, forced to do whatever may be wished. Columbus, after assessing the Tainos' culture and polity, concluded they are also fitted to be ruled and to be set to work. He assured the Spanish monarchs that he could send them slaves as many as they shall order to be shipped. The first of these shipments came the next year in 1493, when Columbus and his crew captured 550 natives under the pretense of trade, loaded them as cargo, and embarked them on a trip to Spain. During the voyage, more than 200 of them died of disease, starvation, and exposure, forcing Columbus to sell the survivors in the Spanish port city of Cadiz rather than taking them to Seville as he had planned. Despite high mortality rates, the selling of more than 300 slaves in Spain yielded quick profit, encouraging others to follow suit. In the first surviving contract for a voyage to the newly discovered lands of the Americas, the Spanish crown granted Vicente Inez Pinzon the right to seize and hold as private property any kind of slaves, black or brown or others, who are considered slaves in Spain or ought to be slaves for some other reason. In other words, anyone they wanted. Enslaving American natives became standard practice for many of the early Spanish explorers, colonizers, including Amerigo Vespucci, who returned to Spain in 1499 with more than 200 enslaved Lacayans in the Bahamas. Official Spanish policy developed quickly in response to the growing number of slaves. In 1503, Queen Isabella declared that since natives had repeatedly resisted Christianity and attacked Spanish standard bearers, any and all persons had the explicit authority to capture them and carry them off, and bring them to the kingdoms and provinces of ours or any other regions they wish. Isabella portrayed slavery as a means to Christianize natives, asserting that by taking them from these regions and putting them in service to the Christians, they can more quickly be informed and instructed in the Catholic faith. Early Spanish settlement concentrated on the island of Hispaniola. We know this story. During the first 3 decades of the 16th century, the Spanish enslaved vast numbers of native people to work in gold mines and agricultural operations. Andres Reséndez has done some really new, interesting work in his latest book that gives important new information about the enslavement of Tainos on Hispaniola and about the trade of non-Tainos to the island. They traded Kalinagos from the southern Caribbean, as well as natives from the northeast coast of Central and South America. The scores of officially sanctioned slaving expeditions represented only a fraction of the total slave traffic, which brought tens of thousands of people into Spanish hands under the pretense of rescuing or redeeming them from the hands of their supposedly cannibalistic enemies. Enslaved natives provided the labor that drove the first sugar boom in the Americas. Spanish ingenios, or sugar plantations, began to spread across Hispaniola, Rico, and other Spanish settlements. I think it's significant that we remember the first sugar plantations in the Americas were not built primarily with enslaved labor. They were primarily built with enslaved Native American labor. In the Bahamas, Spanish colonists used these slaves as pearl divers, prompting a brief but very profitable spike in pearl exports that supplemented decreasing Caribbean gold production. Spanish demand for native slaves dramatically expanded indigenous violence in Central and South America. From Nicaragua alone, Spanish observers estimate that nearly 500,000 people were exported as slaves during the 1520s, 30s, and 40s to labor in Spanish settlements, especially Panama and Peru. A specialized industry in slave shipping developed in the Nicaraguan coast, where ships carrying 300 or 400 slaves on short voyages that allowed several trips per year. These were the first repurposing of merchant ships for the mass shipping of enslaved people in the Americas. Slave raids and collateral warfare decimated Central American populations, combining with disease to reduce peoples of the region to around 10% of their pre-colonial population. Witnessing the murderous consequences of the slave trade, as well as the inhuman treatment of the slaves in Spanish settlements, many Spanish colonists called for a ban on slavery. In Hispaniola, Spanish priests castigated colonial elites for their treatment of native laborers. This is probably the most familiar part of the story. In 1511, the Dominican priest Antonio Montesinos charged his fellow Spaniards with being in mortal sin because of the cruelty and oppression with which you treat these innocent people, warning that their souls would be damned alongside Turks and Moors who lack and reject the faith of Jesus Christ. 5 years later, in 1516, Dominicans and Franciscans joined forces to condemn the enslavement of natives, who were their primary targets for conversion. Of course, this was the year that Las Casas published his first critique of native enslavement. Now, in that tract, he does support the importation of African slaves, a position he later regrets and denies. Despite stiff opposition from Spanish settlers who profited from slavery, royal and church authorities eventually agreed to limit the conditions under which natives could be enslaved. Two kinds of slaves, as we know this story, esclavos de guerra, esclavos de rescate, slaves that were ransomed from non-Christian masters, became the most sort of broad category, and it was most often used to justify enslavement. Facing a continually escalating slave trade, Spanish officials attempted to ban slavery altogether in 1530, but were compelled by angry colonists to lift the ban only 3 years later, restoring the two justifications for slavery and opening the door for a new surge of the slave trade. As the slave trade expanded, so did its detractors. In the 1520s, Las Casas became even more vocal than he had been in 1516. He eventually, of course, as we know, gained audience with Charles V and persuaded one of his friends and supporters to appeal directly to Pope Paul III, who then issued the 1537 bull forbidding the Christian practice of native slavery. Now, the rest of the story for the next several years we know. There was a retraction, there was a reinstantiation, and then eventually in 1542, the new laws of the Indies were passed, and it said that from henceforth, for no cause of war, nor any other whatsoever, though it be under the title of rebellion, nor by ransom, nor in any other manner, can a native be made a slave. Now, predictably, the profitability of native slavery ensured that it would continue despite the Crown's effort to stop it. At least one Spanish official appointed to carry out the 1542 reforms was brutally murdered. Many others were opposed in less violent ways. Thousands of natives continued to be enslaved every year, especially in more distant settlements that were further removed from the control of Crown-appointed administrators. In the Mexican, Peruvian, and Central American hinterlands, slavery remained an important part of Spanish-native relations. On Mexico's northwestern frontier, native slavery persisted into the 19th century. And in Nueva Vizcaya in New Mexico and California, slavery expanded rather than contracted in the centuries following the new laws, and it persisted in some cases into the 20th century. As the Spanish monarchy attempted to eliminate native slavery from its colonies, the Portuguese found new use for native slaves in Brazil. Beginning in the 1510s, but not flowering until the 1540s, Brazilian sugar production created a heavy demand for forced laborers to work in cane fields and mills. Portuguese colonists modeled Brazilian sugar production after the plantations of Madeira, an island off the northwest coast of Africa, where they had developed a highly successful sugar industry in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Importing talent and technology from Madeira to Brazil, the Portuguese also imported the practice of enslaving regional peoples to perform sugar's arduous tasks, as they had done in Madeira. Portuguese demand met a rising supply of native slaves, increasingly available from coastal native allies. Sugar matured as the barter economy of local natives declined, leading to the powerful Tupinambas to explore other means of obtaining European goods, adapting an already vibrant system of trade and enemy capture toward the Portuguese. First the French and then the Portuguese slave raiders also ventured into the interior on their own. The French, as depicted here, had gone in large numbers, much larger numbers than we've previously appreciated, to the coast of Brazil. And they traded mostly in dyewoods, but also in parrots and monkeys and all, cotton and all kinds of other things. But they began by the 1540s to also trade in slaves. By the 1550s, there were enslaved Guaranis in the French countryside. Although Portugal had been trading African slaves in the Eastern Atlantic for a full century by 1540, in Brazil, native slaves predominated throughout the 16th and into the 17th century. Although there are few surviving records that would allow us a full accounting of the slave population, perhaps as many as 100,000 natives were enslaved by the Portuguese in the 1500s. And when you consider the population of the Portuguese colonists, it's fairly significant. Those numbers would only grow to the point where over the course of the colonial period to the abolition of slavery in the late 19th century, at least 1 million enslaved native people were enslaved in Brazil. Although some historians have suggested that native susceptibility to European diseases made them less attractive to potential slaveholders, that explanation does not fit colonial Brazil. For example, natives and Africans both died in large numbers from a disease epidemic raging in northeastern Brazil from 1599 to 1562. If anything, the enslaved Africans died at slightly higher numbers. But the widespread death of native slaves actually increased Portuguese demand for them, making the 1560s the most active period of native enslavement in Brazil's sugar-producing regions. A generation later, in the 1580s, native slaves still outnumbered Africans by more than 2 to 1 on many sugar plantations and by much more in non-sugar producing regions. Not until the first decades of the 17th century would enslaved Africans replace natives in Brazil's sugar economy, and native slaves would dominate in other regions well into the 18th century. As in New Spain, the expansion of slave raiding in Brazil in the 1550s and 1560s inspired critics to work for a ban on native slavery, persuading colonial crown and church officials to limit and eventually outlaw the practice. The most vocal critic of the 16th century slave trade was the Jesuit Manuel de Nobrega, who oversaw Jesuit activities in northwestern Brazil. Although he did not oppose slavery in principle, Nobrega condemned Portuguese settlers for indiscriminately buying captives from their native allies and encouraging unjust wars to produce slaves. Since traditional Tupinamba captive customs involved limited ritual cannibalism, the Jesuit accused colonists of encouraging this practice by rewarding warfare, implicating Christians in an act that was anathema to secular and religious authorities alike. Of course, most of it was overblown and most of it was invented. Refusing to hear the confessions of native slave raiders and frequently petitioning local and crown officials, Nobrega and his allies persuaded the crown that native slavery would damage Christianization efforts and destabilize the colony. But rather than outlawing native slavery, the Portuguese crown attempted to restrict it. And in 1570, they strictly limited enslavement to officially sanctioned wars and legitimate ransom purchases, legitimate, of course, in quotes, corroborated by Jesuit witnesses. Finding it impossible to enforce even these limited conditions and facing stiff opposition from slaveholding colonists, the crown backed away from attempts at enforcement and allowed broader definitions of just war and ransom to ensure a steady supply of forced laborers. Colonists exploited this new loophole vigorously. continuing to buy native slaves in large numbers throughout the 1570s, 80s, and 90s, with estimated totals as high as 40,000 people captured for northeastern Brazil alone in those decades. Increasingly carried out by racially mixed intermediaries called mamelucos, native enslavement became a cooperative endeavor between Portuguese war captains, often known as bandeirantes when they went into the backcountry, mamelucos, and native allies in the interior. During this period, Portuguese colonists began to acquire a growing number of African slaves, as we know, especially in the sugar-rich regions of Pernambuco and Bahia. But in the early decades of the 17th century, thousands of African slaves worked the fields and mills, often alongside a diminishing number of native slaves. On the other hand, what this period also saw was an increase in slavery in Sao Paulo. Natives remained by far the most commonly enslaved population throughout the 17th and into the 18th centuries. Working within the broad parameters of legal enslavement, and often going well beyond the law, residents of Sao Paulo carried out nearly 150 sanctioned slave raids in the 1600s, creating a documented native slave population that approached 30,000 in the city and its neighboring neighboring settlements. These activities were not limited to Sao Paulo, but spread throughout southern Brazil. In 1698, for example, a French ship that docked at Rio de Janeiro reported that mixed Portuguese native slaving expeditions frequently left Rio in search of native victims. These excursions yielded several hundred slaves each year, whom they drive as herds of oxen. Having tamed them a little, they dispose of them in the country to till the ground or employ them in fishing for gold. Further north in the regions near the mouth of the Amazon, native slaves outnumbered Africans well into the 18th century, and in some places, well into the 19th century. According to one northern governor in the late 17th century, a Portuguese colonist esteems more the service of one native than that of two blacks. The former know how to row canoes and make them. They are industrious in hunting and fishing. They have the skill and ability to comprehend all the work they have to do for the whites, which one does not find in the blacks. Throughout the century, demand for native rather than African slaves remained high, despite the ready availability of Africans from the vastly expanded transatlantic trade. As native slavery spread by the 17th century, however, renewed opposition to the practice emerged. Seeking allies to fight their Dutch enemies in the 1650s, Portuguese officials again banned the enslavement of natives, ostensibly freeing even existing native slaves. The ban, supported by Jesuits who wanted to corral natives into their missions as laborers and students of Christianity, enraged local planters and traders who felt that their rights to native labor were being violated. As a compromise, colonial officials rescinded the ban, but required that they have a title to a slave that was legally recognized. And the circumstances of the slave's capture would have to be recorded and verified by Jesuit witnesses who accompanied the war party. Although this requirement was by no means put an end to slave raids, it did lay the foundation for slaves to mount legal challenges, suing for their freedom on the grounds that they had been illegally enslaved. Even in victory, these slaves found very little freedom, however, ending up legally released from slavery only to be reduced to a form of debt peonage or long-term servitude in their former masters. We've certainly seen a lot of evidence of this in recent research on New England, for example. Now, just a brief bit about the English Caribbean. The success of Spanish mining and Brazilian sugar inspired the English and French to establish American colonies and challenge their European rivals. Like their counterparts, English and French colonizers utilized native slavery during the early decades of settlement, shifting in the Caribbean to a predominantly African labor force only in the final third of the 17th century. And by that, I mean the total number of enslaved people tips over the balance in the later 17th century. Obviously, in the Southern Caribbean, especially in Barbados, enslaved Africans predominate much sooner than that. English efforts to colonize the Caribbean begin in the early 1600s with the first successful colonies established in Bermuda in 1612. St. Christopher, Barbados, Montserrat, and Antigua followed in the 1620s and 1630s. English islands quickly developed tobacco to feed a growing European demand, requiring a fast supply of workers for the labor-intensive crop. As we know, much more than the Spanish or Portuguese, the English utilized European servant laborers to perform the drudgeries of cleaning and planting, supplemented by enslaved natives and Africans. In Bermuda, the first English colony to use slave labor in any significant numbers, native slaves came from a wide variety of sources. Other Caribbean islands, the South American mainland, and a few from trade with North American colonies. The early slave codes of Bermuda, which were the first laws to govern English slaveholding in the Americas, reflected the mixed use of native and African slave labor, naming both peoples as legitimate slaves who normally served their masters for a term of 99 years, which was an obvious euphemism for lifelong slavery. The first Englishmen to plant in Barbados in the 1620s brought 10 Africans and 32 natives to the island as enslaved workers, reflecting the mixed use of Amerindians and Africans that had come to predominate in the New World in the early 17th century. Native captives from Suriname also provided Barbadians with their first lessons in planting sugar cane in the 1620s, although the crop would not overtake tobacco as the primary commodity until much later. Well, a few decades later. The majority of native slaves produced tobacco rather than sugar during the first generation of settlement, and they employed their own indigenous practices and knowledge of the crop to do so. In the 1640s, a group of English planters traveled to Pernambuco to learn the secrets of Brazil's successful sugar operations. All of you know the debates about how instrumental that was, how important it was in terms of technology, in terms of the expansion of African slavery. But one piece of that story that's often missed is that they do witness the widespread enslavement of native people, and they follow the Brazilian example in the acquisition of laborers, experimenting with the mixture of native, African, and European laborers before shifting to a predominantly imported workforce of enslaved Africans. With limited access to native slaves from the South American mainland, English Caribbean planters frequently turned to pirates or Spanish contraband traders to acquire native slaves from South America or the Spanish Caribbean. This was obviously more common for those that did not have connections or the money to buy people on the sort of standard slaving routes. But it did become at least a small and steady part of the smuggling economy. The export of native slaves from Carolina, Louisiana, and Canada also reflected the widespread enslavement of natives in Europe's mainland North American colonies. Every colonial settlement from New Mexico to New England either owned or traded native slaves. Oh, there's Bermuda. I forgot to advance the slide. I apologize. In some cases, such as New Mexico, native slavery persisted into the mid-19th century. And as I mentioned, in California and a couple of other places, there are documented instances into the 20th century. As the enslavement of natives waned, as in the rest of the Americas, North American natives participated in slavery in complex ways, occasionally protecting escaped slaves in maroon communities, but also frequently acting as slave catchers and also as slave holders. The enslavement of natives north of Mexico began with the earliest reconnaissance missions, but only reached significant numbers with Spain's expansion during the entradas of the 1530s and 1540s. Undertaken at the height of native enslavement in Mexico and Central America, the expeditions of De Soto, Coronado, and others to the American Southeast and Southwest seized and bartered hundreds of native captives for sale in New Spain. De Soto, who owned native slaves on his own estate in Cuba, prepared to capture more by equipping his caravan with iron chains and collars, which bound captives as they acted as porters during the expedition's long marches. Coronado, although officially discouraged from enslaving natives on Mexico's northern frontiers, actively sought forced native labor throughout his journey. Settling in New Mexico at the end of the 16th century, the Spanish created a new market for native slaves following the Spanish practice of rescate, and between 1600 and 1850, New Mexico's colonists bought thousands, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of Plains and Pueblo natives. Raids extended into the Great Basin, the eastern and southern plains, and into Arkansas and the Missouri River Valley. Natives also captured hundreds of Spanish settlers who played the role of indigenous slaves in native society. Within Spanish villages, ransomed captives occupied a variety of legal and social positions, including chattel slavery, fixed-term servitude, and unfree but landed genesados who acted as a military buffer against European and native enemies. Disproportionately women, these captives often formed relationships with Spanish men, allowing them, and especially their children, to negotiate space for themselves within the local community. Still slaves, however, a large proportion of these women ended up suffering sexual assault, resale to other Spanish towns, or the loss of their children through sale or movement. Plains natives also faced slave raids from the east, reflecting both indigenous patterns of warfare and the new demand for slaves in the French colonies in the Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes, as well as the English colonies in the southeast. As natives sought alliances with French and English to gain useful tools and weapons, they offered captives to new allies to ratify their friendship and to demonstrate their martial prowess. Destructive to the victims of slave raiding, the native slave trade nevertheless benefited some natives allied to the French and English by strengthening their position within the alliance and allowing them to limit and direct colonial expansion, or at least to turn away potential colonial violence. In Louisiana, French officials took an unusual stance for North America, banning the enslavement of natives to position the French as protectors rather than procurers of native peoples. They, of course, did not successfully weed out all native slavery, but they really tried to fight it, mostly because they wanted to draw the friendship of people being targeted by English slaving voyages. The rest is fairly familiar, so I think I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. And I just want to finish up this part of it, the part of the sort of big arc, by talking a little bit about the expansion of Carolina's slave wars and just how close they are to the stories of West Africans. We know from Alan Galley, of course, that the early generations of settlers in Carolina sold enslaved native people to fund the expansion of agriculture and to import enslaved Africans. But we often forget that most of the participants in the Stoner Rebellion, for example, had experienced personally the violence of the Yamasee Wars. And that these slaving wars for native trades and the sort of development of plantation agriculture within the African diaspora are actually often intertwined. It's not one than the other. It's often overlapping, and they inform each other's histories. So what I'm showing right now is a series of advertisements, runaway ads, that are in various English colonies. You can see the various places that these people come from. You see one from Suriname. This one, there's another one, a Spanish Indian man slave. You just sort of see these over and over, Carolina Indian boy. And throughout the colonies, whether it's Boston or Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, these kinds of ads indicate the ubiquity of native slavery. I want to turn to some of the big ideas some of the big questions. Sorry, I don't have any big ideas. It's 3 in the morning. In a span of 8 years, from 1739 to 1747, 3 enslaved Native Americans petitioned colonial courts for their freedom, claiming that they were born free and illegally held in slavery. They lived in separate colonies across 3 competing European empires: Francisca in Brazil, Marguerite in New France, and Will in Virginia. In challenging their slave status, these 4 individuals revealed the logic of racialized Atlantic slavery and showed the persistence of varied slaveholding practices in the Americas throughout the 18th century. And I think that these cases might launch us into some ways we can think about the connections between these 2 systems that are often thought of separately. Slavery played varied roles in these colonies, but on a global scale, of course, the Portuguese, British, and French empires had become, by the mid-18th century, the largest slaveholding regimes in world history, forcing a combined 3 million African captives to the Americas between 1725 and 1775. The vast scale of this trade was only possible because, as I've argued elsewhere, The process of enslavement remained an ocean away from the colonies where enslaved people were taken and then held in slavery. That distinction between enslavement and slavery was crucial to the scale of Atlantic slavery. This insulated European slaveholders from the shockwaves of slaving violence and made it easier for them to avoid asking difficult moral questions about slaves' origins. In claiming their freedom, these enslaved litigants and those who responded to them articulated norms that often went unspoken, providing remarkable clarity to the dynamics of the distinctions between enslavement and slavery and how race does and does not function in these societies. Francisca and Marguerite lived in colonial settlements where native slavery was still legal and where a majority of enslaved people were, like them, indigenous Americans. Francisca petitioned for her freedom in 1739, appealing to magistrates in Belém do Pará, an outpost in northeastern Brazil. You can see that on the map on the right. The red dot is near the mouth of the Amazon. Native slavery was legal there, but only when the conditions of enslavement could be certified as a collateral of a just war, as I explained earlier. Long-standing battles between Jesuits and powerful colonizers over the violence of slaving wars and the effects they had on the missionaries' goals to subordinate native peoples in different ways had resulted in a compromise. The Jesuits would accompany the slavers on their annual raids, armed with the legal right to approve or disapprove of these raids. If slavers targeted people who were the enemies of Portugal, and thus probably also enemies of the native people living in Jesuit settlements, the Jesuits would sign documents certifying that the raid was just. Plenty of slaves entered the colony without that kind of approval, but the property right in those captives would always be vulnerable to a challenge without it. Francisca recognized this dynamic, and knowing that she did not come from a raid that was certified just by the Jesuits, she took a chance and petitioned for her freedom. Without time to delve into the particulars, the essential point here is that this woman's legal status as a slave hinged on colonial scrutiny of her enslavement. If this or that raid, this or that specific enemy did not satisfy those assessing it, the property right in that person would be voided. In the end, the lower court ruled that Francisca did not meet the criteria for legal slavery and ordered her freed. Her master, a powerful and influential man, appealed to a higher court, which ruled in his favor, and Francisca remained a slave, as far as we know, until her death. In New France, Marguerite had a strikingly similar experience just a year later, when she petitioned for her freedom in Montreal. In a lower court, she claimed to be the freeborn child of a native mother and a French father. The court was initially inclined to believe her and offered her a temporary freedom during trial proceedings. Under pressure from the French naval officer who had just purchased her to work on his sugar estate in Martinique, colonial legal officials called in a team of witnesses to testify that she had been traded to French merchants by an allied nation that had captured her in a defensive war with an enemy people. Like Francisca, Marguerite was ruled to be justly enslaved, and her new master shipped her to the Caribbean the following year. The colony of Virginia presented a different kind of challenge to Indian Will. His petition to the court of Northampton County claimed that he had, quote, a right property of freedom as the son of a free native woman, knowing that the laws of your country is entirely against freeborn Indians to be made slaves. Unlike Francisca and Marguerite, whose cases hinged on narratives of just enslavement, Will's hinged on lineal descent, following the logic of maternal inheritance that determined slave status in all plantation economies by the mid-18th century. Will had two burdens of proof. He had to prove that he was a Native American and not, as a probate record listed him only a few years earlier, a Negro man named Will. He also had to demonstrate that his mother was a freeborn woman, or was a free woman when he was born, because many Native women were not free during that period. So simply saying that he was a Native person would not be enough to set him free. On the first question, he had reason to be optimistic. Whatever the notary had written in 1741, people referred to him as Indian Will, a moniker used by the court clerk himself. Will did not come in and say, "Hi, I'm Indian Will." He called himself Will, and the court clerk made a note that this is the petition of Indian Will. Because lineal descent determined property status, the legal fiction of race created incentives for slaveholders to label all enslaved people as black. Virginians had to tip their hands when describing fugitives, as in an ad for recovering a Negro man of the name of Tom, who was described as having much the appearance of an Indian. You saw a few of those ads earlier. We don't know the outcome of this case, but the absence of witnesses suggests that his petition was denied. Getting other planters or those subject to their authority to betray the claims in open court was hard for anyone, but especially for the enslaved. Despite Will's claim that his mother was very well known to be a free Indian by several inhabitants now dwelling in this county, they said nothing. The influential Captain Thomas Marsh had also known for several years that Will was born to a free mother, but, quote, not caring to curry the ill will of his neighbor, Marsh kept quiet. By contrast, Francisca's and Marguerite's cases rested on the particulars of their enslavement, requiring special attention to differentiating among native peoples, rather than lumping together in racial terms. It was unimportant that these women were Indians or natives. No one disputed that. What mattered was whether they belonged to an Indian nation at war with Portugal's or France's native allies. These cases and many like them remind us that a variety of slaveries emerged in the early American colonies and persisted for centuries and followed different rationales. Systems of slaving and slave trading operated on different scales, and the legal and cultural weight of lineage played vastly different roles across time and space. All enslaved people of the Americas, however, shared much in common. They were, in an almost infinite variety of ways, isolated from legal protections, but embedded in communities of support, discounted by those in authority, but trusted with others' stories and secrets. However their enslavement was narrated, however, their slavery was perpetuated. They built lives that could not be contained by that status. Now, this cluster of freedom cases sits at the precise midpoint between, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm not sure I know how to do that. Really trying. Anyone know how to do that? Have I stopped sharing the screen?
No, it's right next to the leave button. There should be the share.
I've killed it. Okay. Do I have like a giant head on the screen there? I just want to raise ways to think about this as I wrap up.
There you
go. As I mentioned, the freedom cases sit at the exact midpoint between 1619 and the establishment or the ratification of the 13th Amendment that finally abolished slavery in the United States. So as an arc within the United States itself, obviously there are many other arcs that matter, but within that arc, at the midpoint, we still have societies that are in the orbit of these colonies and as part of this world of trade where native slavery is predominant. And even in the colonies where African slavery is predominant, we still have a number of indigenous people held as slaves, and they have to navigate very different forms of racial thinking. Now, this brings up a couple of possible ways of starting the conversations here. One is to think about this distinction between enslavement and slavery, because it does require a somewhat different logic of race. When you have a lineal descent, that is the determinative factor of property, versus the act of war in a way that colonizers are embedded within the system, it creates different dynamics, and it creates an idea of differentiating versus lumping, splitting rather than lumping, I guess. Another is to think about the irony that has been pointed out many times for 1619. Many people have talked about the irony that in 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrive in the colony of Virginia, and it is the same month that the Virginia Assembly meets, that becomes the Virginia House of Burgesses, and that's an institution of representative government, and this is an institution of slavery, so it's this great paradox. But if you look at the actual things that the Virginia Assembly discussed during that same month of August 1619, there were three things that predominated their deliberations. Number one was the need to secure land by deed. So they needed to have a surveyor. So they passed the idea of having a surveyor, which then was hired officially 2 years later. They also needed to have rents secured, so they had to have someone come who could collect rents. And then they also, so that's the one thing, is about property. The second is labor. There was an obsession about the lack of labor, and we need to bring laborers of any form. And the third, of course, was this terrible fear at the moment of the Pamunkey alliance being on edge. And so all of the fears of making sure people don't steal corn, they don't steal canoes. And so these three things come together, and it's this assembly that is linking the connection of securing native land, procuring rents, and developing a labor force. So there's another way we can think of that. And the final thing I want to just mention is that when we think about the racialization of Native people and the racialization of people in the African diaspora, we often imagine that the deep history of anti-Black racism operates on a sort of different plane as the racialization of Indigenous Americans. And it's true, of course, that the content of that racial attitude is quite different. And that the things that are impugned to these racial groups are seen to be quite different. The reason for that, of course, has to do with what colonizers need from each group. And so because they need Indigenous people to recede and to leave, they create narratives of savagery, narratives that would take away their claims to land, narratives that would suggest they are not politically organized. And then, of course, when they respond to the rewards of slave raiding by slave raiding, they use that as justification to push them aside because they're violent, they're ungovernable, indomitable, savage. At the same time, of course, the sort of naturalization of enslaved West Africans as being particularly suited and particularly fit for slavery goes on at the same time. So that it's not that one group is racialized and the other is not, it's that they are racialized simultaneously in different ways to serve related ends. I think some of those conversations might be of interest to talk about, and then of course I'm very interested in other questions or other conversations people want to have. So I'll leave it there.